Hello, Leaving Cert students of 2024. Congratulations on finishing English Paper 2 and English Paper 1 yesterday. We obviously saw a very nice English Paper 1 as well as a very nice English Paper 2 today. I trust you guys all got on very, very well. Certainly when we'll go through the paper now in a little bit of time, certainly the poets again that we were kind of thinking about in terms of that were supposed to be on trend certainly did show up. Even our unseen poetry had a very nice question 2 section. The comparative question a lot more simplistic this year than we would argue than last year, and then Hamlet, which we'll launch into now straight away in a moment. Hamlet seems to be the only one that has a slight degree of complexity, but I trust that if we took our time with it and kind of planned it out and had a little look at the intricacies of the question, that you guys would have got on very, very well with it. So we'll dive straight in. Obviously a behemoth of a paper in terms of 3 hours and 20 minutes. If we get straight into the single text section, which I know a lot of you guys would have looked at Shakespeare and looked at Hamlet this year, the 2 questions that showed up, we had our first one, which was kind of a relationship question that explored some thematic concerns. And then we also had this kind of genre style, this more of an open style question in terms of the second question, which we did again feel that was quite on trend. These kind of amalgamations of, when we look at character, relationship, style and theme, these open style questions, which tends to amalgamate a number of those parts into one question. So the first question where the complexity kind of would arise was in the sense that of wording of the question, Shakespeare uses Hamlet's complex relationship with Gertrude. So that's the first main part. We're focusing on the relationship between Hamlet and his mother Gertrude to explore a variety of core issues in the play. And that's the second really important part of this question. So whilst we are looking at the relationship element between Hamlet and Gertrude, we absolutely did have to look at kind of things like appearances versus reality, any sort of duplicity that exists in the play, even good versus evil, treatment of women, obviously that goes without saying, maybe even filial ingratitude. You look at obviously the death of Polonius scene in Act 3, Scene 4, and how Hamlet's manifestation of his frustration kicks in there in terms of when he's shouting at his mother, and that treatment of women, filial ingratitude element in there as well. So that's the first question, very much that how does Shakespeare use this relationship to explore some thematic concerns? And then the second question, which was this, as we said, this genre style open question, discuss the aspects of Shakespeare's play Hamlet that make it a surprisingly positive and hopeful drama. Now, I know certainly a lot of us would have looked at that question there and kind of maybe rejected it because of the positivity, the positive and hopeful drama. It says develop your response with reference to Shakespeare's play Hamlet. So there is wiggle room to challenge there. And certainly if you created that thesis at the start and you said, well, look, there may be some elements of positivity, some elements of hope, but also then there's also negative aspects. But with the positivity, if we looked at again good versus evil and how good does ultimately triumph over evil at the end, we look at some of the characters of Horatio and the loyalty that we see within there, and even Laertes and the loyalty that he shows towards Ophelia and Polonius. There are definitely positive aspects, even the mood and tone at some points as well. Certainly here in the Academy, there's a number of little bits in the notes and stuff that we were focusing on in terms of that positivity, in terms of it being a hopeful drama. The element of drama then as well, you'd have to look at that in terms of the stylistic aspects, as in what makes a drama, and again that would have been part of our answer. But certainly that first question in terms of the relationship between Hamlet and Gertrude and revealing core issues in the play, I would say a lot of us gravitated towards that. And I'm sure we would have got on very, very well. All right, so that's Shakespeare and our single text. There's a number of nice other single text questions there, certainly Dorian Gray, etc., which some of us may have looked at. With regards to the comparative studies, so our second most important question in our English Leaving Cert, worth 17.5% of our grade. If we kind of mainly focus on the 70 mark questions first, if we respectively look at each 70 mark question, so literary genre, compare how effectively at least one technique is employed by the authors of at least 2 texts on your comparative course to manipulate the reader's emotional response to these texts. So again, when it says at least one, we know to make our lives easier, you guys probably were using around 3 or 4 different aspects, 3 or 4 different stylistic aspects, and comparing and contrasting within your 2 or maybe even 3 texts within there as well. That emotional response part of that question, very, very important. That had to be in there in every single key moment that you were using, every single element that you were kind of going to compare and contrast, because that's obviously a significant point. The 70-mark question for cultural context, really nice questions for cultural context and theme and issue we felt here, certainly this year. Question 2, our 70-mark question for cultural context. In the case of at least 2 texts on your comparative course, compare the extent to which aspects, really important word, aspects, features, characteristics of the cultural context prevalent in these texts nurture admirable values and attitudes. So we remind ourselves cultural context is the world in which our characters exist and how that world impacts upon our central characters. So if we look at elements here that nurture admirable values and attitudes, and you're going to compare and contrast because some aspects will nurture these things more in some texts than in others. So that's where we're going to bring in our compare and contrast. We're going to have 3 or 4 points, central points within that question as well. And then you're going to look at morality, behavioural aspects, religion, gender roles, power, money, where people are from, socioeconomic backgrounds, those kind of elements. The same core elements that exist in the majority of our cultural context questions. Theme and issue, and the way that we try and teach our comparative modes here is that, again, there's a nice overlap between these two in terms of theme or issue. In the case of the 70-mark question, again, in the case of at least 2 texts on your comparative course, compare the extent to which the exploration of a theme or issue, so once again, our single theme, so you pick one theme and that's what you're going to explore throughout, instilled in you a sense that human beings are selfless in their thoughts and actions. So if you had a concept of identity, which is what we work on a lot here. Again, you're looking at how people behave. So again, morality, behaviour, what I suppose aspects of your respective theme, again, highlight whether or not these people are selfless in their thoughts and actions. So again, how do they exert power, maybe gender roles, where they're from, etc., etc. So again, a huge amount of overlap potentially between our cultural context and our theme and issue. The back to literary genre and the 1A and 1B split in our 30 and 40 mark questions, the literary genre, discuss how the author in one text on your comparative course employs a variety of techniques to make a relationship in the text believable. Very, very nice that you're looking at dialogue, camera angles, mise en scène, everything in the framing of the shot, that kind of thing as well. And then we're carrying that in to the question B element, which is again the variety of techniques to make a relationship in these texts believable. 1A and 1B in our cultural context, again, discuss the extent to which the level of freedom enjoyed by a central character in one text on your comparative course is determined by this character's social position and status. Again, money, wealth, socioeconomic background, relationships, etc., etc. Okay, and again, that's carried on into the 1B. And then our theme and issue, 1A and 1B split, discuss how an interesting interaction between 2 or more characters at a pivotal moment, so singular pivotal moment, in one of the texts on your comparative course revealed important insights about a theme or issue in that text. So slightly more complex there when we get into the very specific wording. We saw obviously our last paper 1 exam, which was yesterday. We saw people with the question B and the diary entry and the series of diary entries that might have maybe thrown up a couple of issues, whereas here it is at a pivotal moment. So you think about your plot line, you think about exposition, conflict, climax and resolution. So maybe one of those conflicting moments, maybe one of those climactic moments. And again, that's very much carried into our 1B as well. Again, interesting interactions between 2 or more characters at a pivotal moment in each of these texts. So again, we're very much focusing on singular moment and again, revealing those elements of the theme or issue. All right, but certainly those 70-mark questions, very accessible. The 1A, 1B and the literary genre and the 1A, 1B in the cultural context, very accessible as well. The theme and issue, potentially a little bit restrictive with that singular pivotal moment. All right, and then finally, to wrap this up in terms of section 3, poetry, all the fear and trepidation, if you ask kind of people of my age, 36-year-old individual, in terms of, what do they think about in terms of English paper 2, it's always first answer is who came up, what were the poets that came up that year. And before we get into that, which will be the last part, again, we look at our unseen poetry, which a lot of people will leave to last, which we encourage here in the Academy because it's 5% of our grade. But what a 5% this year. Again, we look down to that question 2 question. and they're asking about the poet's use of language. So everything that we'd be talking about here in terms of aesthetic language and all that departmental language, we could have just regurgitated that for our 4-paragraph response in terms of our 20-mark question there. And even the 1A and 1B as well, the poet's use of tone in terms of our first question there, and then the characteristics of the grandfather. So again, characterization of one of the characters in that poem. So really, really nice questions there again in the unseen poetry. Potentially a lot of us leaving it to last, but certainly that question 2 question, which is the one that we gravitate towards because it's very much on trend that they ask us stylistic questions. In that question 2 question, that was a very, very nice one. So when everybody is out and the dust is settled on English paper 2, I think the overarching positivity that'll come from this paper, because as we said, it's a very, very nice paper. I would say certainly maybe the Hamlet questions are the only one that you just have to slightly unpack that little bit further. I think when the dust settles, everybody should be very, very happy with regards to prescribed poetry. We see a lot of familiar faces here in terms of page 7 of the script here. We saw, in terms of the 5 poets that came up, Yeats, Niquillanon, Emily Dickinson and Sylvia Plath, and then Seamus Heaney. So certainly in terms of the female poets, 3 out of the 4 female poets on the paper. Paula Meehan showed up last year. John Donne showed up last year. So the only real maybe potential poet that's not contained here is Hopkins. But certainly when you look at that paper, the fact that Plath is there, the question on Plath about social commentating and that she is a social commentator, and you think about the domestic, you think about motherhood, becoming a new mother, struggles with motherhood, struggles with mental health, self-perception and identity in Mirror, for example. And then in terms of relationships and marriage and how we can struggle with that in terms of, again, mental anguish and mental turmoil. So there's a lot within that Sylvia Plath question that we could have easily gravitated towards. We once again see a Dickinson style question and about her abstract ideas, which again is the cornerstone of Dickinson's work. Eileen Niquillanon, who thankfully we were looking to see here, and she was certainly number 1 on our list. Again, the nature of life element, so that she's using evocative imagery, and that evocative is an adjective, so you can play around with that. But on the nature of life, everything to do with her relationship with her sister, the relationship with her parents, loss of loved ones, the transient nature of time, storytelling, etc. It's all in there. So that's a very, very nice question. Yeats's contradictions, once again, are public and private aspects there as well, which is very evidential. And then with Heaney, his simple style to convey profound observations. So we remind ourselves about the 2 parts. There's always 2 parts to a studied poetry question. That's style element and then the subject matter element. And we would certainly say with those poets, certainly, as I said, there's 5, very noticeable faces on that page there. There is that clear style part, subject matter part, and with regards to the subject matter part, there is, I would say, 0 surprises there. Really nice poetry question, really nice poetry section, I would say, in general, and really nice paper in general. As I said, if we unpack that Shakespeare question, whichever one we did, to that extra level, we should be absolutely fine. And yeah, I think hopefully we'll all agree that this is a confidence booster, and you can build that confidence heading into the rest of your exams. Very best of luck for those exams, and well done on completing both English Paper 1 and English Paper 2.